All right, let's talk about a single year that completely redrew the map of a continent, 1884. We're smack in the middle of this era called New Imperialism, and one meeting in one city, Berlin, is about to set off a chain reaction that we're still feeling today. Let's get right into it.
I mean, that quote kind of says it all, doesn't it? It sounds like something straight out of a villain's playbook. Forget some boring, stuffy meeting with diplomats. This was a room full of the most powerful people on the planet, basically plotting how they were going to divide up an entire continent. Sounds like a movie, but it was all too real.
So just imagine it. The year is 1884. The city is Berlin, and Germany's chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, he's the host. He's called together 13 other major powers, mostly European, but the United States is there too. And in the middle of the room, a map of Africa, a continent whose fate they were about to decide without asking anyone who actually lived there.
But that begs a huge question, right? Why then? What was happening in the world that made all these rival nations decide to sit down together and literally carve up a continent?
The short answer? In 2 words, the Industrial Revolution. This massive shift had completely changed the global economy, and it created this insatiable hunger for more resources, more customers, more power. It was like a giant engine that was about to run right over the rest of the world.
Okay, so this chart really gets to the economic heart of the matter. Factories were just churning out unbelievable amounts of goods, way more than people in their own countries could ever buy. See that line climbing up? That's pressure building. These industrial nations were desperate for 2 things: raw materials to feed their machines and brand new markets to sell all the stuff they were making.
So you end up with this kind of imperial checklist. First, you need raw materials. We're talking rubber for tires and hoses, copper for electrical wiring, palm oil for machine lubricants, and, of course, shiny things like diamonds. Second, you absolutely need new places to sell your products. Third, and this is key, they had the tools to do it. Steamships could push deep into continents, and the Maxim gun, well, that gave a few soldiers the power of a whole army. And finally, it was just pure rivalry. If Britain has a huge empire, well, Germany and France felt like they needed one too, just to keep up.
But how do you justify all this? How do you sleep at night? Well, you invent a really dangerous and completely bogus idea called social Darwinism. It took Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest and twisted it horribly. The argument was that because European nations were more powerful technologically, they were biologically superior. It was a pseudo-scientific excuse, a green light to go and conquer.
So now you've got all these superpowered nations with the motive, the means, and this twisted sense of justification. The scramble for Africa was officially on. But this created a huge new problem. Bismarck wasn't worried about Africa. He was terrified that this competition would spark a massive war between the European powers themselves.
So the stated goal of the Berlin Conference was to lay down some ground rules, to make the whole process of colonization, orderly. But look closely at who they were trying to protect. The goal was to prevent war between Europeans. It was all about them. So as these powerful men are sitting around this table, drawing lines on a map, you have to ask the most obvious and most important question: who wasn't there? And the answer is as infuriating as it is simple. Africans. Not a single African king, queen, tribal leader, or representative was invited to a meeting that was all about the future of Africa. Their fate was being decided for them, thousands of miles away. And the fallout from this, as you can probably guess, was absolutely devastating. The consequences of the lines drawn in that room in Berlin would echo for over a century.
Just look at the difference here. It is staggering. Before 1884, about 80% of Africa was run by Africans. It was a continent filled with thousands of different cultures, kingdoms, and societies. Fast forward just a few decades to 1914, and it's almost completely carved up. And those new borders? They were totally artificial, drawn with a ruler on a map, often lumping rival groups together or splitting unified cultures in 2.
And if you want to see the most extreme, brutal example of this colonial greed, you have to look at the Congo Free State. This massive piece of land, bigger than all of Western Europe, wasn't a colony of Belgium. No, it was the personal property of one guy, King Leopold II. He owned it, like a farm. Leopold's only goal was to squeeze every last drop of wealth out of the Congo, mostly from rubber and ivory. And the human cost was just unthinkable. Historians estimate that his reign of terror led to the deaths of as many as 8 million Congolese people from forced labor, starvation, and outright murder. And if you need any more proof of his monstrous character, get this. When he was finally forced to hand over control of the Congo, he had the entire state archive burned to the ground. His reason, in his own words, "They have no right to know what I did there." It's just chilling.
So the legacy of this conference is just immense and long-lasting. Those artificial borders, they've been a source of ethnic conflict ever since. Local economies were totally rewired to just ship out raw materials, not to feed their own people. And traditional ways of life were completely shattered, which set the stage for decades of struggle later on.
Now, it's really, really important to get this. The scramble for Africa was the most intense example, but this imperial fever was everywhere. It was a global phenomenon. I mean, everybody was getting in on the act. In China, you had European powers carving out spheres of influence. France took over Indochina, Britain cemented its control over India, and it wasn't just the Europeans. The US expanded across the Pacific into places like the Philippines and Hawaii. And Japan, which had just industrialized itself, started building its own empire in Korea and Taiwan. And what was the endgame of all this global competition? Well, ironically, the guy who hosted the conference, Bismarck, saw it coming. He said Europe was like a powder keg, and that all it would take was a single spark to set off an explosion that would destroy everything.
Which leaves us with one final haunting question. The whole point of the Berlin Conference was supposedly to prevent a European war. But by ramping up the competition and creating all this friction, did it actually just make that war inevitable? How did this mad dash for colonies help light the fuse for World War I just 30 years down the road? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this one.